Black teen bullied relentlessly, then calls his father. The most lethal Green Beret alive. Isaiah Carter stood at the threshold of the school's massive stone entrance, his heart pounding in his chest with a rhythm that mirrored the drumming of rain against the blacktop behind him. The sprawling building loomed ahead, its towering brick walls and gleaming windows offering no warmth, only the silent, watchful gaze of a place that had seen countless students pass through its gates, but none quite like him. Clutching the straps of his worn backpack tighter, Isaiah forced himself forward, feeling the heavy weight of unfamiliarity settle on his shoulders. This was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh start, yet every step down the polished hallways told him otherwise. He tried to ignore the stares, sharp, lingering glances that trailed after him like shadows, as he made his way to the front office to collect his schedule. The hallways stretched out like cold arteries, sterile and humming with the low buzz of voices, lockers slamming, and the distant squeal of sneakers on linoleum. Isaiah's sneakers, slightly scuffed from years of use, seemed to squeak louder than everyone else's, betraying his every movement. As he navigated the maze of corridors, clutching his crumpled schedule in one hand, a group of students standing by the trophy case fell silent, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. He caught the flicker of smirks, the way one of them nudged another and tilted his chin in Isaiah's direction. Their laughter was quiet but sharp, slipping through the air like invisible needles. Isaiah swallowed the lump in his throat and kept walking, willing himself not to look back. In the cafeteria, the atmosphere grew heavier. Isaiah moved through the lunch line with deliberate steps, choosing a plain sandwich and an apple, avoiding eye contact with the clusters of students at the tables. His hands trembled slightly as he paid the cashier. Finding an empty table in the corner, he sat down, trying to make himself small, invisible. It didn't take long before the tension found him again. From across the room, a group of boys, their designer shirts crisp and clean, whispered to each other while shooting glances at him. Isaiah kept his head down, pretending not to notice, but the sting of their mockery was unmistakable. One boy, tall with a sharp jawline and a cocky grin, muttered something under his breath loud enough for his friends to snicker. Though Isaiah couldn't hear every word, the tone spoke volumes. It was the tone he had learned to recognize early in life, the thinly veiled disdain wrapped in forced politeness, the kind that didn't need to be spelled out to be understood. By the time he made it to the gym, Isaiah's muscles ached not from physical exertion, but from the sheer effort of holding himself together. During roll call, when the coach asked him to introduce himself, a low chuckle rose from the back of the room. Isaiah forced a polite smile and gave his name, feeling the heat crawl up the back of his neck. As he turned to grab a basketball from the rack, someone intentionally bumped into him, muttering a sarcastic apology under his breath. The ball slipped from Isaiah's fingers and bounced away, hitting the bleachers with a hollow thud. He retrieved it in silence, feeling the invisible line that had been drawn between him and everyone else. A barrier made of assumptions and quiet hostility. At home, the contrast was stark. Their modest house stood on a quiet street, a weathered American flag fluttering from the porch. Inside, the familiar scent of his mother's cooking mixed with the faint, lingering smell of leather and metal polish from his father's study. Marcus Carter, his father, spent most evenings sitting by the fireplace, reading thick books or quietly cleaning the old medals and photographs that marked his past life, a life Isaiah only knew in fragments. To most, Marcus was an enigma, a man of few words whose presence commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. His eyes, deep and often distant, carried the weight of battles fought both abroad and within. Isaiah admired his father's quiet strength, but also feared the vast ocean of experiences he could never quite reach or understand. Isaiah's mother, kind and warm-hearted, bustled through her days with tireless energy, working long hours at the local hospital. She often asked Isaiah about school during their rare dinners together, her voice tinged with concern. He would offer her a strained smile, nodding and saying that everything was fine. She was doing enough already, carrying the weight of their family's future on her shoulders. He couldn't bear to add to it. His struggles at school remained locked away in the silent spaces between his words, a growing burden he chose to bear alone. As the days stretched into weeks, the undercurrent of hostility at school became a relentless tide. It began subtly. A lunch tray knocked from his hands by an accidental bump in the hallway, snide comments murmured just loud enough for him to hear, notes slipped into his locker filled with childish drawings and cruel words. Isaiah told himself that if he stayed invisible, if he didn't react, it would stop. But it didn't. Each act of cruelty fed into the next, emboldening the group that had chosen him as their target. They mocked his hair, calling it wild and unkempt. They imitated his voice in exaggerated tones when they thought teachers weren't listening. Every time he crossed the gymnasium, someone would make a show of holding their nose or stepping away dramatically, as if his very presence was offensive. Isaiah clenched his fists in his pockets, counting breaths, repeating the lessons his father had instilled in him: patience, resilience, silence. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But it wasn't just the words. It was the looks, the stares that lingered just a second too long, the way conversations would die whenever he approached. It was the constant reminder that no matter what he did, he didn't belong. Isaiah's friends were few. Most kids either kept their distance to avoid becoming targets themselves, or simply didn't know how to bridge the silent wall that had been built around him. The group that hounded him the most was led by a boy named Troy Matthews, the son of a prominent local businessman. Troy's confidence oozed from every arrogant smirk, every mocking remark. His cronies, boys whose names blurred into each other in Isaiah's mind, followed him with an eagerness that was almost desperate. They fed off each other's cruelty like vultures picking at a carcass. Some days, Isaiah found himself lingering in the bathroom longer than necessary, just to delay the inevitable walk through the gauntlet of jeers and sneers. He would stare at his reflection, searching for something: strength, anger, understanding, but finding only a tired, worn-out version of himself looking back. There were moments when he clenched the edges of the sink so hard that his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to breathe through the storm swirling inside him. Every night, lying awake in his bed, Isaiah replayed the day's humiliations in his mind. He imagined different outcomes: standing up to Troy, knocking him flat in the cafeteria, shouting back instead of swallowing his pride. But the fear of the consequences, of becoming exactly what they expected him to be, kept him silent. At this school, he understood all too well, one wrong move could brand him permanently. And so, each morning, Isaiah pulled himself out of bed, laced up his sneakers, and walked back into the storm. He told himself it would get better. He told himself he was strong enough. Yet with every shove, every insult, every stolen moment of dignity, a crack formed in the armor he had so carefully built around himself. Still, he endured. He sat through classes where teachers either didn't notice or chose to ignore the subtle warfare happening under their noses. He weathered the stares in the cafeteria, the isolation on the basketball court, the loneliness of being an outsider in a place that prided itself on sameness. He carried the silent burden of knowing that no matter how hard he tried to blend in, his skin, his voice, his very existence marked him as different. Through it all, Isaiah clung to the lessons of his father. He remembered the stories Marcus told him late at night, not of battles and victories, but of endurance, of facing impossible odds and choosing to hold on to one's humanity. His father had survived wars in distant lands. Surely Isaiah could survive this war in the halls of a high school. Yet, as the days grew shorter and the bullying more brutal, a part of Isaiah began to wonder how much longer he could carry this weight alone. Each slight, each blow to his pride, stacked atop the last, building something inside him he could neither name nor contain. A slow-burning fury, a desperate yearning to be seen not as a target, but as a person worthy of respect. And though he tried to bury it deep, to smother it with the teachings of patience and strength, Isaiah knew a reckoning was coming. A moment when silence would no longer be enough. A moment when he would have to choose between enduring quietly or reaching out into the unknown, hoping that someone, somewhere, would hear him before it was too late. The air in the locker room was thick, heavy with the smell of sweat and damp clothes. The low hum of laughter echoed off the cold, tiled walls, wrapping around Isaiah like a noose. He barely had time to react when he felt a sharp shove against his back, propelling him forward until he stumbled into the corner near the row of battered lockers. Metal clanged under his palms as he caught himself, the sudden impact sending a dull ache up his arms. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with a sneering group of boys. their expressions twisted with cruel amusement. At the front of the pack stood Troy, the unspoken leader, his blue varsity jacket hanging open as if to show off the muscles he clearly believed made him invincible. His smirk widened when he saw the flash of anger in Isaiah's eyes. Troy stepped closer, closing the gap until Isaiah could feel the boy's breath on his face. He pressed a forearm against Isaiah's chest, pinning him to the lockers with an ease that spoke less to strength and more to the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. The taunts began, each word sharpened to a razor's edge. They slung slurs at him with casual cruelty, digging into his skin like barbed wire. The others jeered and laughed, their voices bouncing around the room, amplifying the humiliation. Troy leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a poisonous whisper, throwing out jabs not just at Isaiah, but at his father, questioning his strength, mocking his service, suggesting that Isaiah would never be anything more than a shadow, too weak to carve out a place for himself. Isaiah's entire body tensed, a storm raging just beneath the surface. His fists clenched at his sides, the veins on the back of his hands standing out against his skin. His mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to fight back, to throw a punch and wipe the smug grin off Troy's face. He could already see the moment playing out in his head, a sharp swing, a satisfying crack of bone against bone. But just as quickly, the consequences unfurled in his mind like a grim slideshow. He could see himself being dragged to the principal's office, labeled as the problem, the aggressor. He could hear the whispered conversations, the knowing looks from teachers, the confirmation of every stereotype he had spent his life trying to outrun. He thought of his father then, of Marcus Carter standing tall in the living room, his voice calm but firm as he talked about battles, about how real strength sometimes meant walking away. Isaiah had nodded along at the time, but now, faced with the white-hot humiliation burning in his chest, those words felt like a chain, holding him back when every fiber of his being. Before he could make a decision, the boys pushed the cruelty even further. They threatened to spread rumors, to paint him as a coward, someone too weak to even stand up for himself. The thought clawed at Isaiah's mind, the fear of being misunderstood, of being isolated even more than he already was. It wasn't just the physical bullying anymore. It was a slow, deliberate attempt to dismantle him from the inside out. The final shove came with a sneer and a laugh, leaving Isaiah sagging against the lockers, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The boys left, their footsteps echoing down the hall, their laughter trailing behind them like a bad smell. Isaiah stood frozen for a long moment, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer effort it took to keep himself contained. When he finally pushed away from the lockers, it felt like he was moving underwater. Every step was heavy, weighted down by a sadness that reached into his bones. He stumbled through the hallways, keeping his head low, ignoring the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed him like shadows. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over everything, making the world look even more bleak and distorted. Isaiah didn't know where he was going until he found himself outside, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. The courtyard was empty, the benches damp with the remnants of a recent rain. He collapsed onto one of them, his hands still shaking, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs. The silence around him was deafening, pressing in from all sides. He stared down at his hands, at the raw red marks where Troy had shoved him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt utterly powerless. Tears stung the back of his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. He clenched his fists again, willing the trembling to stop, but the emotions inside him refused to be tamed. The anger, the shame, the helplessness, they churned together, an uncontrollable storm threatening to tear him apart. He needed help. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. As much as he had tried to shoulder everything alone, to bear the weight of his struggles in silence like his father had taught him, he couldn't do it anymore. He was drowning, and pride wasn't going to save him. His fingers fumbled for his phone, the familiar weight of it grounding him just enough to make the next move. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the contact he hadn't touched in years, his father's number. Memories of their strained conversations flickered through his mind, brief check-ins, stiff reassurances, But beneath it all was a bond forged in something deeper, something that had never fully broken, even with the distance between them. Taking a shaky breath, Isaiah pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and for a moment he feared it would go to voicemail. Then a click, and the familiar, gravelly voice answered. No greeting, just a simple, steady Isaiah. For a heartbeat, Isaiah couldn't speak. The words jammed in his throat, too heavy to push out. But then the dam broke, and he found himself confessing everything. The bullying, the isolation, the constant battles he fought just to make it through each day. His voice wavered, cracked in places, but he didn't stop. He poured it all out, every raw and aching piece of him laid bare across the fragile line of connection. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that could have been mistaken for judgment or disappointment if Isaiah hadn't known better. But when his father finally spoke, his words were a lifeline, pulling Isaiah back from the edge. You don't have to fight this battle alone, son. When you're ready, I'll be there. The strength in Marcus Carter's voice wasn't loud or commanding. It was steady, unbreakable, like the roots of an ancient tree. It was enough, more than enough. Isaiah hung up the phone with hands that still trembled, but now there was something else mixed in with the fear and anger. A glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He sat on the bench for a while longer, staring out across the empty courtyard, the weight on his chest feeling just a little lighter. He knew that one phone call hadn't solved everything. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was facing it alone. The pain was still there, the wounds still raw, but now there was a thread of strength running through it, connecting him to something bigger than himself. The seed had been planted, and even though the path ahead was still uncertain, Isaiah knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were heavy, the air around Isaiah charged with a restless energy he had never felt before. Every step he took through the halls of the school felt weighted, his chest a battlefield of emotions. Fear still lingered in the corners of his mind, but something new stirred beneath it. Something steady, something he wasn't ready to name yet. The call to his father had cracked open a door he had long kept bolted shut, and now, despite the lingering threats and sneers, he carried himself differently. He no longer walked with his head down, no longer shrank into the background. There was a quiet strength now in the way he moved, a tension that refused to break. But the bullying did not relent. If anything, it clawed at him with renewed ferocity, as if sensing the shift and desperate to crush it before it could take root. Whispers followed him down corridors, laughter echoed from behind lockers, and his locker itself became a canvas for cruel jokes and crude messages scrawled in permanent marker. Isaiah erased them with stoic determination, each swipe across the metal surface a silent vow not to be undone. Yet the weight of it pressed harder against him, and no matter how much he tried to steel himself, the moments alone were the hardest. It was in the quiet spaces, the deserted stairwells, the dim corners of the library, where the sting of isolation seeped into his bones. On a gray afternoon, heavy clouds stretching across the sky like an ominous curtain, Isaiah found himself walking toward his last class of the day when he realized the hallway ahead was unusually empty. The silence gnawed at his senses, setting his nerves on edge. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find another route, but pride and stubbornness anchored his feet. He tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack and kept walking, each step reverberating against the linoleum floor. They came out of nowhere. Troy, flanked by 2 of his usual accomplices, emerged from a side hallway like wolves circling a wounded deer. Isaiah barely had time to react before they closed in, shoving him backward into the lockers with a loud metallic thud that echoed down the corridor. The impact rattled his bones, but he stayed on his feet, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. Troy smirked, his eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. He muttered something low and venomous, an insult wrapped in a racial slur that made Isaiah's stomach twist. The words hit harder than the shove, a cruel reminder of the ugliness Isaiah had tried so hard to endure in silence. Before he could recover, another shove knocked the air from his lungs, sending him sprawling to the floor. His backpack skidded a few feet away, its contents spilling out like the pieces of a life these boys were determined to shatter. Laughter broke out among them, sharp and bitter, bouncing off the empty walls. Troy stood over him, triumphant, the sole architect of this humiliation. For a fleeting moment, Isaiah saw himself as they wanted him to be, broken, small, insignificant. A flicker of helplessness surfaced, threatening to pull him under. But then, like a flash of lightning splitting through the storm clouds, his father's voice cut through the noise in his mind. Choose your battles wisely, son. Strength isn't always about fighting harder. Sometimes it's about standing taller. Isaiah exhaled shakily, pushing himself up from the floor, not with fury but with calm, deliberate movements. His body ached, but his spirit refused to yield. He straightened to his full height, squaring his shoulders even as Troy sneered down at him, expecting Isaiah to cower, to lash out, to give them another excuse to label him the problem. Instead, Isaiah stood still, eyes steady, heart pounding with a different rhythm, one not born of fear, but of purpose. Before another word could be spoken, a new sound broke into the scene, the heavy, authoritative thud of boots striking the floor with precision and weight. The sound alone commanded attention, slicing through the tension with brutal efficiency. Heads turned toward the end of the hallway, and there, emerging from the dimness like a figure carved out of the very storm clouds overhead, was Marcus Carter. Isaiah's heart stopped for a breathless second, a surreal disbelief washing over him. His father stood there, no uniform, no medals, just a simple black jacket and dark jeans, blending into the shadows but radiating a power no clothing could mask. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but the energy around him crackled with something fierce and unspoken. The faint lines around his eyes told stories of battles fought and survived, of pain endured and overcome. Every inch of him exuded an unshakable certainty, a man who had seen the worst the world could offer and had never once bent to it. The boys froze, their laughter choking in their throats. Troy's smirk faltered, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to process the sudden presence of this stranger who seemed to fill the entire hallway with nothing more than his silence. Marcus's gaze found Troy's and held it, an invisible force pinning the boy in place. There were no words, no threats, just a look, a steady, piercing look that stripped away bravado and exposed the trembling child beneath the bully's mask. The tension was suffocating, a rope tightening with every second that Marcus remained silent. Isaiah watched, awed and humbled, as his father took a slow, measured step forward. Troy instinctively stepped back, his bravado crumbling into uncertainty. The two boys beside him exchanged nervous glances, the bravest among them swallowing hard before bolting down the hallway, footsteps slapping desperately against the floor. Troy hesitated for a heartbeat longer, pride warring with fear, before he too stumbled backward and disappeared around the corner, leaving only the scent of cowardice in his wake. Silence reigned in the aftermath, broken only by the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rustling of Isaiah's scattered belongings. Slowly, Marcus turned his gaze to his son, the fierce intensity softening into something quieter, deeper. He walked toward Isaiah with the same unhurried, deliberate pace, each step grounded and certain, as if anchoring Isaiah to something unbreakable. Reaching him, Marcus paused, his presence enveloping Isaiah in a cocoon of safety he hadn't realized he was desperate for. He didn't speak right away. Words would have been too small for the weight of the moment. Instead, he placed a hand firmly on Isaiah's shoulder, the calloused strength of it a grounding force, an unspoken promise that Isaiah no longer had to weather this storm alone. Isaiah met his father's eyes, finding there not just pride but an unwavering belief that cut through all the lies he had been forced to swallow. A knot that had been tightening in his chest for months loosened, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe fully. "You don't have to fight alone, Isaiah." The words were quiet, barely more than a breath, but they echoed louder than any shout, resonating through Isaiah's entire being. In that sacred stillness, the boy who had carried the unbearable weight of isolation realized he didn't have to bear it anymore. His father was here, not just in body but in spirit, a living testament to the power of silent strength and steadfast love. The pain, the fear, the loneliness, they all lost some of their grip in that moment, replaced by something far stronger. Isaiah bent down to gather his things, his father wordlessly kneeling beside him to help. Together, they picked up the scattered pieces, small actions woven with unspoken understanding. As they stood up side by side, a quiet determination settled over Isaiah, not born of revenge but of resilience. The battle wasn't over, but now he knew he had an ally by his side. Someone who had seen the darkness and refused to be consumed by it. Someone who believed in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. The hallway stretched before them, long and still, and waiting. Marcus gave Isaiah's shoulder a final squeeze before releasing him, stepping back just enough to let his son take the lead. Isaiah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something solid within him. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, lifted his chin, and walked forward, not as a boy beaten down by the world, but as a young man who had found, at last, the quiet, invincible strength that came from standing tall in the face of it. In the days that followed, a shift rippled through the halls of Isaiah's school, so subtle that it almost went unnoticed at first. The boys who had once hunted him through corridors and classrooms with cruel smirks and harsher words now steered clear of him, casting furtive glances when they thought he wasn't looking. The once oppressive weight of whispered rumors, of sidelong stares and stifled laughter, seemed to lift from the air, dispersing like smoke in the wake of a strong wind. Isaiah walked with a steadiness that had been absent before. A quiet confidence coiled inside him, humming just beneath the surface. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper, a certainty that no amount of scorn could uproot. He felt the difference most acutely in the small moments, the ones no one else seemed to notice. In the way the teachers now looked at him with a touch more respect, or how classmates who had once been eager spectators to his humiliation now kept their distance, uncomfortable and unsure. No longer a target, Isaiah found that he had become something else entirely, a quiet force, steady and immovable. Yet he bore no malice in his heart. The anger that might have once flared inside him now felt unnecessary, a weight he no longer needed to carry. One late afternoon, with golden light slanting through the living room windows, Marcus sat with Isaiah in the worn armchair across from the old couch, the space between them filled with an unspoken understanding. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional creak of settling wood. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his weathered hands folded loosely. His voice, when it broke the silence, was low but firm, carrying the weight of years lived and lessons hard-earned. Strength isn't about beating your enemies, son. It's about knowing when to stand tall and when to walk away. He reached out, pressing his hand gently against Isaiah's chest, not with force but with intention, as if marking the spot where true strength resided. You're learning the most important lesson, that your worth isn't defined by the people who try to break you. The words settled over Isaiah like a mantle, heavy yet comforting, threading themselves into the fabric of who he was becoming. Isaiah met his father's gaze, something unspoken passing between them. It wasn't just pride swelling in his chest. It was understanding, a fierce, unwavering light that had been lit and could not be extinguished. The scars of what he had endured were still there, faint but lasting, woven into his story. The memories of being pushed, laughed at, cornered in empty hallways would never fully disappear. But now, they no longer dictated the way he moved through the world. They were part of him, yes, but they no longer owned him. When he returned to school, Isaiah felt it in every step he took down the once daunting hallways. The lockers, the cracked tiles, the endless buzz of fluorescent lights. All of it seemed different somehow, less oppressive, less like a battlefield. He didn't lower his gaze anymore. He didn't quicken his pace to avoid confrontation. His walk was measured, deliberate. Every step a quiet testament to the battles fought and the victories won. Not through fists or shouted words, but through resilience and a resolve that spoke louder than any act of defiance could. There were still whispers sometimes, still glances cast from corners and doorways, but they no longer pierced him. They bounced off the invisible armor he wore, forged from his father's lessons and the knowledge of his own worth. Isaiah carried himself with a dignity that could not be taught in textbooks or demanded from others. It came from within, born from pain, and nurtured by love. The trauma of what he had endured hadn't vanished. It lurked in the quiet moments, surfacing in flashes that caught him off guard, a sudden clench in his chest when laughter erupted behind him, a fleeting doubt when a group of boys gathered too close. But now, Isaiah knew how to steady himself, how to breathe through the fear and remember who he was. The boy who had once crumbled under the weight of cruelty was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that strength wasn't in fighting back with fists, but in choosing not to let hatred shape him. As he walked through the school one morning, the sun slanting through the windows casting long shadows on the floors, Isaiah felt something settle inside him, an assurance that he was exactly where he needed to be. His journey was far from over. Life would throw more challenges his way, more trials to test the foundation he was building. But he was no longer standing at the edge of those battles alone. His Father's presence, the lessons etched into every fiber of his being, walked with him. Justice, dignity, worth. These were not things that needed to be shouted to be heard. They were things lived quietly, powerfully, in every choice he made. And Isaiah was ready to meet whatever lay ahead with the calm, unbreakable strength that came not from a clenched fist, but from a heart that refused to be conquered.